So today our notes are going to continue on. So yesterday we talked about the reproductive structures. We talked about the function of all of them. So now we'll talk about the process of fertilization and then embryonic and fetal development over time and eventually um, delivery and birth and so on. So you guys just graphed what's going on in the reproductive cycle over a period of 28 days, which we kind of assume as the average length of a reproductive cycle, even though it does vary. And there's the key event of that was what? What's happening around halfway through of that reproductive cycle? What happened after the spike in 3 out of the 4 hormones? What was going on in the ovary? Anybody? What's going on in the ovary at day 14 that is crucial to pregnancy? Darian, ovulation. Ovulation, which is so during the first part of the cycle, a follicle within the ovary, which has an immature egg in it, the egg was growing, the follicle is growing, the egg is maturing to become viable. Around day 14, when those hormones spike, the follicle opens up, okay, and it releases this egg into the oviduct where it starts to travel. So I got some models here from the back corner of the room. These are the ovaries on each side. They're nearby these fallopian tubes. So the ovary itself releases the egg into the oviduct, and then it sort of slowly makes its way through the oviduct. Inside of the oviduct, there's cilia, which sort of guide the egg as it's moving along this pathway. This is the time and this is the place when this egg could be fertilized. Okay, the egg could be fertilized by a sperm cell while it's in the oviduct. And so as it's slowly traveling, if there are sperm present, they can make their way to the oviduct, penetrate the egg, and actually fertilize it. And that's what fertilization means. It's the combining of one sperm cell and one egg cell. And so there's some interesting things in that. So the sperm cells are deposited in the vagina. And so then how do they make their way all the way? They have to go through the cervix, through the uterus, up into the fallopian tubes to find the egg. The eggs, as it's released, is actually secreting chemicals that the sperm cells are sort of attracted to. So that's how they sort of navigate their way to this egg cell. Again, a male can release hundreds of millions of individual sperm cells. Only a few dozen actually can make that journey successfully to the egg. And, Jordan? Okay. And only one actually can penetrate the egg and fertilize it. So the egg has this sort of surrounding layer. And as soon as a single sperm cell penetrates that layer, it almost instantly changes to become impenetrable to any other sperm cells, because it's really important that only one sperm cell enters the egg. What if more than one sperm cell entered the egg? What would the problem be? Exactly. There would be too many chromosomes. Remember, the developing embryo needs really 46 to be a healthy, viable embryo. And so if 2 sperm cells entered, it would have way too many chromosomes. It never would grow and develop. There'd just be too many chromosomes. So that's why there are these adaptations that only allow a single sperm cell to enter the egg cell. And then you have in this resulting fertilized egg cell the 23 chromosomes that were in the egg cell, and then the 23 that were delivered by the sperm cell. and that forms 46. So there's a term for that. So after the egg cell is fertilized, it's called a zygote. It's the very first stage of development is a zygote. A zygote has 46 chromosomes because it has 23 from the sperm cell, 23 from the egg cell. And then this is in the oviduct. As that zygote then continues its journey, it starts dividing. Once it's been fertilized, it starts to divide. It starts as one cell. It divides into two cells. Okay? Those each divide into 4 cells. Bless you. They divide into 8 cells and 16 and 32 and so forth. The series of those cell divisions in the beginning, the term for it is cleavage. It's being cleaved in two. And then each of those cells are cleaved in two. What type of cell division is doing all of this? What's taking this single-celled zygote to a 96-celled embryo? Meiosis or mitosis? Which one? Who's confident in their answer? Why? Yeah, because the gametes already were produced. So then that zygote that has 46 chromosomes, how's it going to form 2 cells of 46? It has to be mitosis. So yes, it grows into 2 cells by mitosis. They go through mitosis. We have 4 cells, 8 cells, 16, and so forth. It forms sort of a little ball of cells. A solid ball of cells is the first step. It's called a morula. It means, I think, blackberry in Latin, because it's a series of little cells. That's what it looks like. Eventually, that solid ball of cells becomes hollow. Eventually, an indentation starts to form. That's going to become the mouth and the digestive tract. And then layers of cells start to take on special roles. So this is an important word, differentiate. In the beginning stages of this, all the cells are basically identical. They're just generic cells up until we reach the phase when the indentation forms. And then they start to become different from each other. Cells start to take on a certain role. Some cells are destined to become skin cells. Some cells are going to become nervous system cells. So that process, when they start to take on like a specific role, is called differentiation. And again, it makes sense. The cells are becoming different from each other. They're no longer just generic identical cells. Now, we'll talk mostly about human development. But some organisms, they don't have internal development like humans do. Most animals, other than mammals, have what we call external development. And what that means is egg cells are just released into the water. Sperm cells are just released into the water where they fertilize the egg cells and the embryo grows in the water. Think about fish. This is what fish do when they spawn. The female fish lays eggs. The male fish releases sperm. Sperm cells find the egg cells, fertilize them, and then the eggs just grow in the water. They're not inside of the animal. That's called external fertilization and external development. And so we see it in fish. We also see it in amphibians, right? Has anyone ever seen frog eggs or been in like a creek or a pond you pick up? They're all held together in this mass of like this jelly-like substance. These are frog eggs. And then they grow and they develop. These eggs are sort of on their own. After the female lays the eggs and they're fertilized, they're just on their own to grow and develop. They have a yolk to provide energy for development, and eventually they hatch and form individual organisms. Reptiles, once animals evolve to go onto land permanently, then there needed to be other ways of reproducing. So obviously, the eggs can't just be laid on land and fertilized on land because they would dry out. So through evolution, what happened is the egg developed, the external egg, such as birds have. or reptiles, they have an egg surrounded in a waterproof shell. And what that does is it gives inside of that shell a watery environment for the embryo to grow and develop. Okay, so they can reproduce on dry land. And this is present in some insects, reptiles, birds, even a few mammals do lay eggs. Most mammals have internal development. And so we see some examples: turtle eggs, chicken egg. Here's even an insect hatching from an egg. These allow for reproduction on land. So this is a slide that shows us actual microscopic images of the beginning stages of development. What we have in the top left is a zygote, a single fertilized egg. And then it's divided by mitosis into 2 cells and 4 cells and 8 and 16 and 32. So that process is the beginning stage. And then we see this indentation starting to form. That's going to become the digestive tract of this organism. It indents and goes all the way through the animal. And this is when cells start to differentiate. They form layers. So we move on and talk about mammals. There's sort of 3 different groups of mammals. Monotremes are just a few mammals that actually lay eggs, including like spiny anteater and a duck-billed platypus. Those are monotremes. They're actually mammals, but they lay eggs. Then we have the marsupials. You know anything about marsupial reproduction? Yeah, marsupials have a pouch. What's that about? Anyone know what that pouch is used for? I saw, this is so weird. I don't know why. Somehow on either, maybe it was Facebook or maybe it was TikTok, the video came up where a guy was in Australia and there's a little baby kangaroo, a joey, and he was wearing like a kangaroo suit and it had a pouch in it. Have you seen this video? And he went up to the little Joe and he opened up the little pouch and the actual little kangaroo got in his little pouch and was hanging out there. I don't know. Maybe it's just my algorithm. Anyway, is it about kangaroo suits, Joe? Oh, yeah, quickly. So anyway, before I was distracted by person in a kangaroo suit. So marsupials give birth to a very, very immature offspring. They give live birth to a little thing that looks like a gummy bear. It's tiny, it's squishy, it's pink, and just looks like an embryo. And then it crawls through the mother's fur into the pouch. And inside of the pouch is where the mammary glands are. And basically stays there for a long time, nurses, and finishes its development. So marsupials almost like give birth twice. Once to this little tiny embryo that crawls into the pouch, and then again, once it's developed and can become independent and leave the pouch. Did you ever watch a video like in 7th grade about the marsupial, little tiny going in there? But we're mostly focusing on placental mammals. Humans are placental mammals. Pretty much almost any mammal you think of is a placental mammal. Okay, so placental mammals, the young develops internally in the womb, in the uterus. And so if we go back to our egg cell that was released during ovulation, if it's fertilized in the oviduct, it continues its path, okay, through the oviduct into the uterus. And as you know from the activity you just did, the lining of the uterus is growing. It's thickening. It's being enriched with blood vessels. It's waiting for this embryo. That's its purpose. It's waiting for this embryo to go into the uterus, because what the embryo will do is attach to the wall of the uterus. And it will stay there for 40 weeks. That's where the embryo will develop, in the uterus. The uterus is also called the womb. And where this embryo attaches is where the placenta will form. What is a placenta? Anyone know what a placenta does or what its purpose is? John? Yeah. It's how it provides nutrients for the developing fetus and oxygen. It also allows waste products from the fetus to be removed. It's a place where the mother's blood vessels are right next to blood vessels from the fetus, but their blood doesn't actually mix together. So the mother's blood doesn't go into the fetus as it's developing, and blood from the fetus doesn't go into the mother. They go right next to each other so that materials can diffuse back and forth. They're not directly connected. What connects the developing embryo or fetus to the placenta? Yeah, the umbilical cord is basically filled with a few blood vessels, arteries and veins that carry the fetus's blood to the placenta and then back. And so that's what the umbilical cord is, just blood vessels carrying the blood to the placenta and back. Here are the monotremes. These are the egg-laying mammals, duck-billed platypus, spiny anteater, also called the echidna. There's really not many examples, but they lay eggs. Here's what this is a platypus egg. It's tiny, and when it actually hatches, it gives birth to this tiny little organism that then have to be nursed by the mother for an extended period of time. Here's the newborn spiny anteater before it develops its spines. Pretty cute, huh? Marsupials, again, there are some marsupials. What kind of marsupial could you find here around where we live? Yeah, possum is one of the few marsupials that are around where we live. Where do you find most marsupials? Australia. Because of the way the continents moved and because of evolution, most marsupials are now found in Australia, like a koala, a kangaroo, obviously, and there's a bunch of others as well. Sugar glider. This video doesn't work. Okay. So, bless you. Shoot. Okay. So placental mammals, like humans, after the embryo makes its way into the uterus, it attaches to the wall of the uterus. A placenta forms, the umbilical cord forms. The fetus is also surrounded by an amniotic sac that's filled with fluid. So here we see just a drawing. So the placenta is this. This is a real picture of a placenta. It just looks like a bloody bunch of blood vessels. You could see this was attached to the wall of the uterus. When you look at this model, here is the placenta. It's attached to the wall of the uterus. This umbilical cord connects into the developing embryo and fetus, and it goes in, connects with the circulatory system. It's part of the circulatory system of the fetus. And so in this placenta, oxygen that the mother has in her blood diffuses into the fetus's blood. Waste products from the fetus diffuse into the mother's blood, and she could then get rid of it. Does a developing fetus like this, does it breathe?
No, because it's using the umbilical cord.
Well, I would say it's using the placenta to get oxygen. Yes. So the fetus never breathes. Its lungs are actually filled with amniotic fluid that it inhales. When does it take its first breath? When does the fetus take its first breath? When it's born, right? Because after the fetus is born, the placenta breaks away from the uterus, and then it's no longer getting oxygen from the mother. Then it has to breathe independently. Have you ever heard of people giving birth in like a pool or like a tub of water. And the reason they can do that is because until the baby's fully emerged, it's not breathing. It doesn't have to breathe as long as it's connected to the placenta. And so sometimes women give birth in water. Some people have the philosophy it's easier on the baby being born because it's going from a watery, warm environment, and then it goes into the tub of water, and then they bring it out, and then the mother can start nursing it, and the placenta pulls away. This is what the umbilical cord actually looks like. Looks like this. After the baby's born, what happens to the umbilical cord? What does somebody do? Cut it. I cut all my daughter's umbilical cords. Sometimes I let the father do it. Sometimes a nurse might do it. It's kind of rubbery. It's just like, and they cut the umbilical cord, and eventually it's going to heal, right? If you've ever known newborn babies, there's a section. So they tie off the umbilical cord really close to the abdomen, and then they put a little clamp farther out. And between where they tied it off and the clamp it falls off eventually, within a few weeks after the baby's born, turns like black and just falls off. And then what's left over is just sort of the scar of where the umbilical cord was, and that's what the belly button is. It's where the umbilical cord was, attaching a person to the placenta while they were in the uterus. So if we look at this is like an early stage. This is soon after implantation. After the embryo has implanted, we can see this is the wall of the uterus enriched with blood vessels because of the hormones you just were graphing. This is the placenta that has formed. It's connected through the umbilical cord to the embryo. There's also a yolk for a little while that provides this embryo with its initial energy that it needs to start growing and developing, but it gets used up pretty quickly, and then the nutrition starts coming from the placenta. Okay, so we sort of got ahead of ourselves. So fertilization. One of the questions in your lab was asking out, well, when can the egg be fertilized, or when is a woman most likely to get pregnant? Right around the time of ovulation is the answer, right? Because sperm cells can't live that long. They could live for a couple days maybe. The egg is only viable for a couple days. So if intercourse happens around the time when the woman is ovulating, then all of the events can line up. Sperm cells can reach the egg cell and fertilize it, and she can become pregnant. Some women might track their reproductive cycle to if they're trying to get pregnant. They know if they can know when they're ovulating, then they can maximize their chances of actually getting pregnant, because you have to have sex around the time of ovulation in order for a woman to get pregnant. But there's like a window. Because sperm cells could live for several days and the egg's viable for several days, it's not like if you only have sex on a certain day that a woman can become pregnant. There's sort of a window. So it happens in the oviduct. And if the egg isn't fertilized within about 24 hours, it just breaks down. And then the fertilized egg, the zygote, starts to divide through mitosis, implants in the wall of the uterus, and starts to develop there. We already talked about the placenta and umbilical cord. The amniotic sac is sort of a thin membrane that surrounds the fetus as it's growing. It's filled with fluid, kind of cushions the fetus, so it's not just kind of rattling around in the uterus, bouncing around when one's walking. It's floating in a little bubble of liquid. So, some terminology we use. When we talk about prenatal, that natal means birth. So prenatal means before birth. You may have heard, like, if a woman is trying to get pregnant, she might take prenatal vitamins. They're just vitamins to ensure she has the right vitamins, minerals to maximize her chance of having a healthy pregnancy. The first stage of development is a zygote. It is a fertilized egg cell. It's only a zygote for a very short period of time when it's one cell. Once that cell starts to divide, we start to use the term embryo up until the 8-week mark. We call that developing organism an embryo. From 8 weeks until birth, the term that we use is a fetus. And then after birth, we call it whatever, Frank or Susie or whatever the name is. Postnatal is a term for after birth. And then how long is a human pregnancy? A full term?
9 months.
Yeah, that's what we say. A lot of times you'll say 9 months. It's actually a little longer than that. Yeah. So usually, like, doctors will say 40 weeks is like the midpoint. And like anywhere from 38 to 42 is like, it could vary in there. Sometimes a woman might give birth, a week or even 2 weeks after her due date, sometimes a couple weeks before. But if we go well before 2 weeks, then we have what we call preterm or premature birth. When a woman is pregnant and has a developing fetus, and basically almost anything she ingests into her body can affect the fetus. And so this is why when a woman's pregnant, then she'll be told to avoid alcohol or smoking or drugs or sometimes even eating large amounts of certain types of fish that might have mercury. So these things, even sometimes viruses, can make their way to the fetus and go across the placenta into the fetus and cause effects on the fetus. Drinking alcohol or smoking drugs during pregnancy can result in premature birth, low birth weight, or even sometimes things like fetal alcohol syndrome. If a woman is an alcoholic and the fetus is constantly exposed to alcohol as it's developing, the fetus can actually be born dependent on alcohol because of that constant exposure. So there's all sorts of things that woman has to be aware of when she is pregnant. We have tools that doctors use to sort of check the health of the fetus. A sonogram, you've, I'm sure, heard of. Here's one. It's just sort of a picture using sound waves of the developing fetus. They can do lots of things. It's not just to sort of see the baby. They can tell the age of the fetus. They can tell if parts of it are healthy, if the brain and heart are developing properly. They can listen to the heartbeat, all sorts of different things they can tell doing an ultrasound. Amniocentesis, they can withdraw a small amount of amniotic fluid, and that has cells from the fetus inside of it. And so they could tell sometimes if there's any genetic abnormalities, if there's any chromosomal issues with the fetus, they can often tell that from doing this amniocentesis. And also, miscarriages are relatively common. Between 10 to 20% of pregnancies actually end in a miscarriage. A miscarriage is when, for some reason, the embryo fetus is not able to survive and doesn't make it through the entire development process, and that's what a miscarriage is. It doesn't. It's unable to survive independently. Here are the stages of the embryo. So this is the up until about 8 weeks. So we can see how it changes from the zygote. In the early stages, it looks like basically it could be any vertebrate. Looks the same in the first stages. Can't tell if it's going to be a chicken, a human, or a bird. Eventually, it starts to take on, obviously, more human-like characteristics as development continues. So this is about the embryo stage. This is about 60 days into the pregnancy. While it's growing, the uterus, which was, again, a hollow muscle, is expanding, right? As this fetus grows inside of a woman's body, the uterus is expanding with the fetus. And obviously, you could eventually tell by a woman's distended abdomen. What really, it's her abdomen is swollen because that's her uterus is expanding to accommodate the fetus that's inside. And then if we are going on towards the end of pregnancy, the term for the beginning of the birthing process is labor. So the uterus itself is a muscle, and like any other muscle, it can contract. And so when a woman is pregnant and at the end stages of her pregnancy, labor might start, and she might start to feel contractions. What she's feeling are contractions of the muscle of the uterus. What's one of the first, if a woman's at the end of her pregnancy, what's one of the first, if she's not feeling contractions, what's something else that happens that sort of clues her in, like, I'm going to be having this baby soon? Water breaks. Because the amniotic sac that surrounds the embryo, that's filled with fluid, it ruptures oftentimes. And that fluid might leak out through the vagina. And so if that amniotic fluid is leaking out, that's the sign she's going to be having the baby, usually within 24 hours. Because once that amniotic sac breaks, doctors want her to have the baby within a day, because there is a chance bacteria, because that seal around the fetus is broken, it's possible then for bacteria to start to take hold. So they want her to give birth within 24 hours of that. That's usually one of the first signs, but it doesn't always happen. Sometimes a woman goes into labor and her water never broke. Sometimes the doctor might actually rupture the amniotic sac. And that kind of speeds along labor if she's having contractions. But the uterus starts to contract. And at first, contractions are mild, not really painful, not very intense, and they're spaced out. Maybe every 15 minutes, the woman can kind of feel that she's having a contraction. But each time the uterus contracts, it's pushing the fetus down against the cervix a little bit. And it's opening up the cervix, the opening of the uterus. It's dilating. And so we talked about this as a positive feedback mechanism. The more the fetus pushes against the cervix, that releases hormones that makes contractions stronger, which pushes the fetus even more, which releases more hormones. And so the contractions become more intense. They speed up and they're happening closer together. And that will continue throughout what we call labor. And what's happening is this fetus is being pushed lower into the uterus. The cervix is starting to dilate and open up to about 10 centimeters or so. And then that allows for the fetus to start to move into the birth canal, into the vagina. And then we call that part of birth delivery. So labor is sort of pushing the fetus into and through the cervix, and then pushing the fetus out through the vagina is what we call delivery. Typically, delivery in a woman has to so the contractions happening in labor are involuntary. A woman has no real control over them. Hormones are controlling them. Sometimes the doctor might give artificial hormones to speed things up if they want labor to happen more quickly. Once delivery starts to happen, then typically the woman has to bear down and push the fetus out through the vagina. And that process, eventually the fetus comes through the pelvis. The shoulders are the widest part. And so the fetus kind of turns as it's coming out. Eventually it's pushed completely out through the vagina in a natural vaginal birth. And then after that, there's another step. Once the fetus is actually out of the mother's body, the placenta tears away and the placenta comes out afterwards. One time, just a quick story. A friend of mine is a nurse. And when he was in nursing school, he was in his first rotation in obstetrics, and it was the first time he ever saw a baby being delivered. And so he's very young. I think he was like 18 or 19. And so he was there, and the woman, and he was kind of just observing as a nurse, as a nursing student. The woman gave birth to the baby, and then the doctor or the nurse was saying, okay, keep pushing, keep pushing. And he said, oh my gosh, it's twins. But really, it was just the placenta. They were asking her to push out the rest of the placenta. And so he was kind of embarrassed by that. But, you know, we'll finish up. There's just a couple of other things that we will finish up with on Monday.